Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive where we like to take these really complex stories that have been in the headlines and really try to break them down and understand what happened.
That's right.
So today we are diving into the story of Charlie Javice and her startup called Frank.
Yeah, a fascinating story. We've got a lot of different sources that we're going to try to pull together for you today.
Absolutely.
Uh, you know, News reports, court transcripts, um, really trying to piece together what exactly happened here.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting for the listeners because it touches on a lot of things that I think a lot of people are thinking about and dealing with,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to like starting a company.
Right.
So,
So, Frank, this company, it was really all about trying to solve a problem that a lot of people have.
yeah, I mean, just navigating the whole world of student loans and financial aid for college.
Right.
I mean, it's so complicated.
It,
There's
uh,
all this paperwork, the FSA forms, and trying to figure out grants. It's like a maze. And it's confusing for students and parents.
Extremely.
It can be really overwhelming.
And Charlie Gervais, I mean, she saw this and she was pretty young at the time, right?
Yeah, she was like 31.
31 years old when
It's just incredible to think about.
It is, it is. She's like, okay, I can create a company that is going to help students and their families navigate all of this. And it seemed like a pretty good idea.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of people saw the potential.
yeah,
And investors were really excited about it.
absolutely.
She was able to raise money.
Right.
She was on magazine covers.
Forbes 30 under 30.
Exactly. I mean, she was really seen as this like rising star in the tech world.
Absolutely. And then this huge, and this is really what brings us to this story. JPMorgan Chase acquired Frank.
Yeah, for $175 million.
It's an enormous amount of money.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a life-changing amount of money for most people.
Absolutely. And it signals that they saw something big.
They did. They really thought they were buying access to this like huge market of young people.
Right.
Frank claimed to have 4.25 million student users
Right.
on their platform. So that means 4.25 million potential customers for JPMorgan Chase.
Right. Yeah. So if you think about it, you've got these young people, they're going to be needing banking services, credit cards, loans, all these things.
Exactly. And JPMorgan Chase was like, we want to get in on that.
Yeah.
We want to be the bank that these students choose.
Right.
So it seemed like a really smart move on their part at the time.
So that's the setup.
Yeah.
This huge acquisition, a
Right.
young, very successful entrepreneur
Seen as a visionary.
has a real problem.
And then it all starts to unravel.
And that's where things get really interesting, or I guess really troubling.
So let's talk about the unraveling. What happened?
What the problem was that 4.25 million student users, it turns out that number wasn't quite accurate. Oh, okay. So how inaccurate are we talking here?
Pretty inaccurate.
Pretty inaccurate. Okay.
Like really inaccurate.
Really inaccurate.
According to the legal proceedings, Frank actually had closer to 300,000 actual users.
300,000 versus 4.25 million.
That's a huge discrepancy.
That is an enormous difference. So how does that even happen?
Right, well, that's the million-dollar question, or I guess in this case, the $175 million question.
$175 million question, exactly. So how did this happen? Did they just miscalculate? I mean, was it an honest mistake?
That's what Javice initially claimed.
Yeah.
She said it was just a misunderstanding.
Okay.
But the prosecutors, they dug a little deeper,
Okay.
and they uncovered a pretty shocking story.
And what did they find?
Well, they alleged that Javice actually hired a data science professor
Okay.
to create a massive database of fake user information.
Wait, so she made up users?
Allegedly, yes.
Oh.
Names, email addresses, even physical addresses, all made up.
So it wasn't just like inflating the numbers a little bit.
No, this was a whole elaborate scheme to create this phantom user base.
So they created this whole fake database and used it to trick JPMorgan Chase.
That's what the prosecutors alleged. They said she used this fake data during the due diligence process.
Due diligence is like when they really look under the hood, right?
Yeah, it's when the buyer, in this case, JPMorgan Chase, they do their homework.
Right.
They check the financials, they look at the data, they try to make sure they're getting what they're paying for.
So they're making sure they're not getting ripped off.
Exactly.
But in this case, they allegedly were.
That's right.
Because of this whole fake database.
Right.
Yeah.
And, this wasn't just about boosting her company's valuation.
Okay.
I mean, Javice, personally, made a lot of money from this deal.
How much are we talking about?
Well, she got $45 million directly,
45 million.
and another $21 million was set aside for employee bonuses.
So a lot of people benefited financially from this alleged deception.
At least in the short term.
In the short term.
Right, because obviously things didn't exactly end well.
No, they did not. So the deal goes through, they celebrate, I'm assuming, and then things start to unravel. So how did JPMorgan Chase realize that something was wrong?
Well, once they started trying to actually use this platform
Okay.
to reach out to these 4 million students,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing.
Crickets.
Pretty much, yeah. They sent out marketing emails, tried to onboard these new users, and the response was just abysmal.
It wasn't adding up.
Not at all.
So what did they do?
Well, they started digging deeper into the data.
Right.
And eventually they realized that a lot of it just didn't make sense.
Okay.
And then they filed a lawsuit.
And it wasn't just any lawsuit.
No, it was pretty scathing.
They accused Javice of being very brazen in her tactics.
Exactly. They felt completely duped.
Right.
They said they had been deliberately misled.
And of course they shut down Frank.
Yeah, the website disappeared. The platform was shut down. Just like that.
Gone.
All that money they had invested, gone.
Oof.
Poof.
And then the legal case against Javice.
Yeah, that went to trial earlier this year.
And?
In March, the jury found her guilty on all counts.
All counts. So what were the counts specifically?
Wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy.
Pretty serious stuff.
Oh, yeah. She's facing up to 30 years in prison.
30 years. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
It is. I mean, the U.S. Attorney, Damian Williams, he called it one of the boldest corporate frauds in recent memory.
One of the boldest corporate frauds in recent memory.
Oh, yeah. Pretty serious stuff.
So I think, we've laid out what happened, but it's always important to kind of zoom out and think about what this means. What are the bigger implications here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this story raises a lot of important questions about the startup world, about the pressure to grow quickly, about due diligence.
Yeah, so let's start with the pressure to grow quickly. A lot of startups, they are really focused on, getting big fast.
Oh, yeah. It's all about hockey stick growth.
Hockey stick growth.
That really steep upward curve on a chart.
Yeah.
And that makes sense to a degree, right? I mean, investors want to see that a company has the potential to be huge.
Absolutely. But it can create this kind of environment where the numbers become everything.
Right. And sometimes those numbers can be fudged a little bit, or in this case, a lot.
A lot.
And that brings us to this idea of fake it till you make it.
You hear that a lot in the startup world.
You do, and I think there's a fine line there.
A very fine line.
Because on the one hand, you need to have confidence, you need to project success.
Right.
But on the other hand, you can't just make stuff up.
Right.
You can't deceive investors.
No, and that's where this case, I think, is really important for people to understand. This wasn't just like a little exaggeration. This was allegedly deliberate and systematic fraud.
Exactly, and it had huge consequences.
Huge consequences, not just for Javice, but for the company, for the employees, and for JPMorgan Chase.
And for the whole idea of trust in the startup ecosystem.
Right, because if investors can't trust the numbers, if they can't trust the founders, then it becomes much harder for startups to raise money.
Exactly, and that hurts everyone.
It hurts everyone. So this story is really a cautionary tale.
It is, and it highlights the importance of due diligence.
Right, that's the homework that JPMorgan Chase was supposed to do.
Yeah, and it's not just for big companies like JPMorgan Chase.
Yeah.
I mean, any investor, anyone thinking about putting money into a startup needs to do their due diligence.
They need to do their homework.
Exactly. Don't just take the numbers at face value.
Right, look under the hood, ask tough questions.
Absolutely.
And I think the most important takeaway from this whole story for me is that quote that you mentioned earlier, always verify, because some unicorns turn out to be mirages.
That's such a good quote.
It is a good quote.
Because it reminds us that things aren't always what they seem.
Right, especially in the startup world where there's so much hype and excitement. So if you're thinking about investing in a startup, or even just following the news about startups, be skeptical.
Ask questions, do your research, and remember that sometimes the shiniest, most promising companies are the ones that are hiding the biggest secrets.
And that is our deep dive into the story of Charlie, Javice, and Frank.
A fascinating story with a lot of important lessons for all of us.
Absolutely. And we'll be back next time with another deep dive into the stories behind the headlines.
See you then.
Until then, stay informed.
And stay skeptical.
Thanks for listening.